Chapter 1. The Forgotten Train. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing Denver in soft white silence. Jack Callahan sat by the window of his small apartment above a hardware store, watching the street below. The lamp on his desk flickered, casting long shadows across the stack of old case files he hadn't touched in months. Jack wasn't the type to dwell on the past, but nights like this, the cold and quiet ones, had a way of dragging it back. He wasn't always a recluse. 5 years ago, Jack had been one of the best detectives the Pinkerton agency had. He chased down outlaws, uncovered schemes, and stared down men who thought they were untouchable. But one bad case was all it took of a mistake. A bullet that missed by inches, and Jack walked away from it all. Now, the most excitement he saw was the occasional bar fight or stolen watch. He told himself he didn't mind. Jack sipped his coffee, lukewarm and bitter, when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed up the stairwell. A knock followed, 3 sharp raps. "Callahan, you in there?" Jack sighed and opened the door. Standing there was Thomas Green, a wiry man with thin glasses and a permanent frown. Green worked for the railroad, which meant trouble. "I'm off the clock, Tom," Jack said, leaning against the door frame. "This isn't about some lost luggage," Jack, Green said, pushing his way inside. "It's the Cascade Bell." Jack raised an eyebrow. Everyone knew about the Cascade Bell, the luxury express train that cut through the Rockies on its way to Chicago. It wasn't just a train, it was a rolling palace for the rich and powerful. "What about it?" Jack asked. "It's gone." Jack blinked. "Gone?" "Vanished." "Somewhere in the mountains," Green said, pacing across the room. "Supposed to pull into Denver 3 days ago. Never arrived. No wreck, no distress signal, just gone." Jack frowned. Trains didn't just disappear, not without someone noticing. "Send out a search crew." "Of course. We've had men out there since day 2, Green said, shaking his head. "They are found nothing, not even a piece of track out of place." Jack crossed his arms. This wasn't his problem, he didn't work for the agency anymore. But then Green pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Look, I wouldn't be here if this wasn't serious," Green said. "A man showed up in Durban this morning. Henry Slater says he was on the Bell when it disappeared." Jack's gaze narrowed. "Where is he now?" "Durban Clinic. Doc says the poor guy is barely holding it together. Frostbite, ranting about things he saw in the mountains." Jack frowned. Slater's name rang a bell, something about land deals or mining rights, but he couldn't remember. Still, one survivor when the rest of the train had vanished. That was worth a second look. Green shifted uncomfortably. "Jack, I know you're out of the game, but the company's paying good money for someone who knows the mountains, someone who doesn't scare easy." Jack looked out the window. Snow was still falling, the wind tugging at the corners of the buildings across the street. He thought about saying no. "All right," Jack said finally, grabbing his coat and hat. "But I'm not making promises." By the time Jack boarded the search train heading toward Durban, night had fallen over the Rockies. The carriage was nearly empty, save for 2 railroad workers drinking quietly in the corner. Jack sat by the window, watching the dark ridges slide by. The snow thickened as they climbed higher into the mountains, swirling around the train in ghostly patterns. Jack rubbed the frost from the glass and squinted into the distance. For a moment, he thought he saw lights flickering along the tree line, far from any station or town. Jack straightened, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination. But deep down, Jack Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was already watching from the ridges. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Snow. Durban wasn't much of a town, just a cluster of wooden buildings huddled together against the cold, like they knew winter could swallow them whole at any moment. Jack Callahan stepped off the train onto the icy platform, tugging his coat tighter around him. The air bit at his face, and snow crunched under his boots as he walked. The clinic was easy to find, it was the only building with smoke curling from the chimney. Jack pushed open the door and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of antiseptic and something that reminded him of rusted metal. "Can I help you?" a nurse asked, peering over her round glasses. "I'm here to see Henry Slater," Jack said, brushing snow off his hat. "Upstairs, second door on the left." Jack climbed the narrow staircase, the wood creaking underfoot. He knocked once before pushing open the door. Henry Slater sat by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out at the snow-covered trees. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes seemed to focus on something far away, something Jack couldn't see. "Mr. Slater," Jack said, stepping inside. Slater didn't turn. "They said someone would come." His voice was thin, like he hadn't spoken much in days. "I'm Jack Callahan. I'm here about the Cascade Bell." At the mention of the train, Slater's hands tightened around the blanket. He finally turned to look at Jack, and there was fear in his eyes, real fear. "You wouldn't believe me," Slater said softly. "Try me." Slater hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. Jack sat, pulling out a small notebook. "It started the second night," Slater began, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I was in my compartment reading. The train was moving smooth, cutting through the snow, but I heard something strange, like footsteps, but not on the floor, on the roof." Jack frowned. "Animals?" Slater shook his head. "Too heavy. I thought maybe a worker was up there checking something, but when I looked out the window, I saw no one, just snow and trees flying past." Slater's eyes drifted to the window again, as if expecting to see something there. "Now, at night, people started disappearing," he continued quietly. "No screams, no struggle. I woke up, and the woman in the compartment next to mine was gone. The door was locked from the inside. Her luggage, everything, was still there, but she wasn't." Jack tapped his pen against the notebook. "How many disappeared?" "And by the third night, half the passengers," Slater whispered. Jack paused. "And you didn't think to stop the train?" "We tried," Slater said, his voice rising. "But the conductor, he was gone too. There was no one driving the train." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying Slater. Either the man was losing his mind, or something strange had happened in those mountains. "Slater, the railroad company gave me the passenger list," Jack said, pulling the folded paper from his coat. "I want you to look at it, see if anything stands out." Slater hesitated, but took the list. His eye scanned down the page until his hand suddenly tightened around the edges. "These names," he whispered. "What about them?" Jack asked. Slater's face turned pale. Some of these people, they weren't on the train. I would have noticed them. He pointed to a name. Daniel Greaves. I know for a fact this man wasn't there. I talked to almost everyone in the lounge car. He wasn't one of them. Jack frowned. He took the list back and studied the names. Some had strange marks beside them, like faded ink smudges. Are you sure? Jack pressed. Far better, Slater nodded. Absolutely. And look at this one, Caroline Price. I remember her now, but she wasn't on the train at first. She just appeared one night, sitting in the dining car like she'd been there all along. Jack's grip on the list tightened. He didn't like coincidences, and this was starting to feel like one. I need to ask you something else, Jack said carefully. Have you heard of the Ghost Line? Slater's eyes widened, and he swallowed hard. The miners talked about it, old tracks out near Black Summit. Said a train disappeared there a long time ago. They say it still runs, but only when the snow falls heavy. Jack tucked the passenger list back into his coat, but Slater's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. It's not just the story, Slater whispered urgently. I saw lights in the trees out there in the mountains, like lanterns swinging, but no one holding them. Jack pulled his arm free and stood. Get some rest, Slater. I'll take it from here. Slater slumped back in his chair, but as Jack reached the door, the man called out. Wait, Slater said, digging into the blanket. From beneath the folds, he pulled out a small gold ticket stub and handed it to Jack. I found this in my pocket the night I made it to Durban. I don't know how it got there. Jack took the ticket and turned it over in his hand. The gold shimmered faintly in the dim light. It looked pristine, untouched by the snow or cold. Then Jack's eyes narrowed. The date printed on the stub wasn't from the past. It was dated 3 days in the future. Jack didn't say a word. He just slipped the ticket into his coat pocket and stepped out into the cold Durban night. Chapter 3, Tracks in the Snow. The cold seemed to press harder the deeper Jack Callahan moved into the mountains. Snow fell in thick curtains, covering the landscape in a blanket of white, and the tracks beneath his boots barely made a sound. He'd followed the Cascade Bell's last known route for miles, watching the snow swallow the world around him. No birds. No wind. Just silence, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the last person on Earth. Jack adjusted his scarf and kept walking. The search train he'd taken from Durban stopped at Pine Bluff Station, a small depot on the edge of the Rockies. From there, the rest of the trip had to be made on foot. The station master, a wiry man named Benson, had been the last person to see the bell before it disappeared. You're wasting your time, Benson had said, tugging his coat tighter around his thin frame. The psychology of the human mind, Callahan replied, staring down at his employer in terror. The train's gone. Callahan vanished into the snow like it never existed. Jack had just stared at him. Trains don't vanish, Benson. Something happened out there. I need to know what. Benson hesitated, then glanced around nervously. I saw something the night it disappeared, he admitted. I was closing up the station when I spotted lights along the tracks, lanterns swaying back and forth like someone was walking the line. But there shouldn't have been anyone out there. Jack frowned. Could have been workers. Benson shook his head. There was no train scheduled that late, and besides, it was floating on the water. Jack didn't say anything. He'd dealt with ghost stories before, usually nothing more than superstition, but this one felt different. He left the station and kept moving along the tracks, following them higher into the mountains. After a few hours, the faint outlines of footprints began to fade beneath fresh snow. Then he saw it, a tunnel. It cut through the mountains, wide and dark, with thick icicles hanging from its edges. But there was something strange about it. Jack hadn't seen this tunnel on any map. He pulled out the railroad plans Green had given him back in Denver. The line ended 2 miles back. This tunnel wasn't supposed to exist. Jack stepped closer, brushing snow away from the sign that hung near the entrance. The paint was faded and chipped, but he could still make out the words, Black Summit Pass. Jack froze. He remembered Slater mentioning Black Summit, the site of the old ghost line. This can't be real, Jack muttered. He stepped into the tunnel. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a moment, Jack could have sworn he heard footsteps echoing behind him. He spun around, but the tunnel was empty. Jack shook it off and kept walking, his breath forming dot clouds in the icy air. Halfway through the tunnel, he heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, soft enough that he thought it was the wind. But as he walked, the voices grew louder. Jack paused, his heart pounding, and strained to listen. It wasn't just noise. The whispers were saying his name. Jack! He spun around. Again, nothing but shadows. Jack rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling. The cold was probably messing with his head. But as he stepped out of the tunnel, his foot hit something hard beneath the snow. He knelt down and brushed away the ice. A rail car. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The car was half buried in snow, its windows frosted over. But he recognized it immediately. The Cascade Bell's dining car. It shouldn't have been here. Jack climbed the steps, gripping the cold metal railing, and pushed open the door. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The tables were still set, silverware and crystal glasses lined perfectly in place. Plates of food sat untouched, steak and potatoes now frozen solid. Half-empty wine glasses sat next to chairs that had been pulled back, as if someone had just left. But there were no people. Jack moved slowly through the car, his footsteps the only sound. It was as if everyone had vanished in the middle of dinner. At the far end of the car, something caught his eye. A coat draped over one of the seats. Jack stepped closer and ran his fingers over the fabric. It was warm. His eyes narrowed. The snow outside hadn't touched the car, but this coat hadn't been here long. Jack didn't know what had happened to the passengers, but one thing was clear, the Cascade Bell hadn't been abandoned for long. And whoever, or whatever, had left it behind might still be close. Chapter 4 of The Warning. But the locomotive, that was where the truth lay. Jack needed answers, even if part of him wasn't sure he wanted them. After half an hour of walking, Jack spotted it through the snow. The massive black locomotive rested at the bottom of a small ravine, tilted slightly to one side as if it had slid gently off the tracks. No smoke, no steam, but aside from the snow piled around it. The engine looked untouched. Jack frowned. A derailment like this should have left debris everywhere. There should have been damage, bent metal, shattered glass, but there was none. It was almost as if someone had set the train down carefully. Jack climbed down into the ravine, gripping the side of the locomotive as he pulled himself up onto the platform. The engine's door creaked as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, no conductor, no engineer. The control panel was intact, switches and levers frozen in place as if the train had been abandoned mid-journey. Jack's eyes drifted to a small compartment near the back of the cabin. The door was locked, but after a few hard tugs, it snapped open. Inside was a small leather satchel. Jack pulled it out, brushing off the dust, and flipped it open. A telegram lay folded neatly inside, its edges yellowed but the ink fresh. Jack unfolded the paper and read, "Midnight. We are no longer alone. Something is aboard. It is not human. Do not stop. Do not." The message ended abruptly. Jack's grip on the paper tightened. He scanned the rest of the compartment but found nothing else, no maps, no additional letters, just that single unsent telegram. Jack stepped back outside, the snow swirling around him. Not human. Jack wasn't the type to believe ghost stories. He had spent years chasing criminals who relied on fear and superstition to stay hidden. But there was something different about this. Jack climbed down from the locomotive and glanced at the tracks. They didn't end at the ravine. A faint path stretched further into the mountains, barely visible beneath the snow. Jack followed it carefully, footsteps light. His hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip, the tracks led him to an old wooden sign half buried beneath ice. Jack wiped away the snow and read the carved letters, Black Summit Pass closed 1894. Jack's heart skipped. Black Summit. Henry Slater had mentioned it, the ghost line that local miners whispered about. Jack hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now. Jack knelt by the tracks, tracing the faded wood with his gloved fingers. In 1894, a train had derailed along Black Summit Pass, the Morning Star Express. All 36 passengers vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found. According to the stories, the train still appeared on snowy nights. Jack rose to his feet, brushing the snow from his coat. Ghosts weren't real. But something was. As Jack turned to head back toward the locomotive, something caught his eye. A black leather binder sat half buried near the tracks, the edge just visible beneath the snow. Jack knelt and pulled it free, shaking off the ice. It was the Cascade Bells passenger manifest. Jack flipped through the pages, reading the list of names, each one carefully typed, each compartment accounted for. He paused halfway down the list. His name was there, Jack Callahan, compartment 3C. Jack's breath fogged in the cold air as he stared at the words. His hands trembled slightly. He had never boarded the Cascade Belle. He wasn't on that train. But the list said otherwise. Jack glanced around at the snow-covered landscape, suddenly feeling very small. His name was on the list, and the train wasn't finished with him yet. Jack Callahan followed the faint tracks through the snow, his boots sinking deeper with every step. The dining car of the Cascade Belle sat behind him, half buried and empty. But he knew the rest of the train had to be somewhere. And he was going to find it. The snowstorm had settled into a quiet hum soft enough for Jack to hear the crunch of ice beneath his feet. After nearly an hour of hiking along the snow, a shadow jutted out of the snow. It was the locomotive. The engine leaned slightly to one side, derailed and frozen in place. Despite sitting in the middle of a snow field, the metal looked oddly untouched by rust or decay. Jack narrowed his eyes. It was as if the train had been preserved, like something wanted to keep it exactly as it was. Jack climbed up onto the engine, brushing snow from the door. It creaked open with a heavy groan. Inside, the cab was dark and quiet. The levers and controls were still in place, but the seat where the conductor should have been was empty. No bodies, no blood, nothing. Jack's flashlight flickered as he swept the beam across the narrow cabin. In the far corner, near the coal bin, he spotted a small compartment. The door was locked, the brass handle iced over. Jack dug his knife into the gap and pried it open. Inside, a small leather satchel sat neatly against the wall. Jack pulled out the satchel and unfastened the straps. WLEX Sir Hargrave, the priest, smiling pleasantly as he looked. His fingers brushed against something hard, paper. He tugged out a yellowed telegram, its edges curled and cracked from the cold. The words typed in hurried strokes made Jack's blood freeze. Cascade Bell. Black Summit boarded. Do not. Schumer cannot stop. If received, pray we do not reach Denver. As he stared at the message, he flipped the telegram over. It had never been sent. Later that night, Jack sat by the fire in Pine Bluff Station, turning the telegram over in his hands. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes. Benson, the station master, sat across from him, chewing on the end of a cigar that wasn't even lit. His eyes squinted at the telegram, but Jack could tell the man wasn't surprised. "You ever hear of the Black Summit disaster?" Jack asked, keeping his voice even. "Dangerous?" Benson nodded slowly. "Everyone around here has happened back in 1894. A freight train got lost in a blizzard. By the time they found it, well, let's just say the cargo wasn't what they were expecting." Jack leaned forward. "Cargo?" Benson's gaze flickered to the snowstorm outside the window. "Passengers. Dozens of them. No one could explain it. There wasn't supposed to be a single person on that train, but there they were, frozen solid in their seats." Jack frowned. "They weren't on the manifest." Benson shook his head. "That's the strange part. The names on the list didn't match anyone from town. Some folks said they were ghosts, others thought they were lost souls trying to catch a ride somewhere." Jack exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. The Cascade Bell wasn't just missing, it was trapped. Jack unfolded the passenger manifest he'd taken from the dining car. The names were faint, smudged by time and cold. His eye scanned the list, stopping near the bottom. And there it was, Jack Callahan. His own name printed neatly alongside the others. Jack's stomach twisted, but he kept his face calm. He folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. "Thanks, Benson," Jack said as he stood. "I'll be back in the morning." But as Jack stepped into the cold night, he had the sinking feeling he might not have until morning. Chapter 5. Jack stumbled toward it, shoving the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the room was dark and empty. A cracked lantern sat on the counter, and faded posters hung along the walls, their edges curling from the cold. Jack dropped his bag near the door and knelt by the fireplace. He struck a match and lit the small pile of wood left behind. As the fire grew, Jack leaned back against the wall, letting the warmth sink in. His eyelids felt heavy. Maybe he could rest just for a moment. But the moment Jack closed his eyes, he heard it: footsteps. Steps away. Closer. Slower. Away from the pace of his thoughts, pain crept into Jack's body. He snapped upright, hand flying to the revolver at his hip. Across the room, shadows began to take shape, figures dressed in suits and dresses from another era. Their faces were pale, eyes sunken, but they weren't hostile. They looked afraid. One man stepped forward, his hands trembling. Jack recognized him instantly. "Henry Slater," Jack whispered. The man nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pass the veil." Jack's brow furrowed. "What veil?" Slater's gaze shifted toward the snow-covered tracks outside. "The bell isn't gone. It's caught somewhere in between. We're trapped." "And you?" Slater hesitated. "You've been with us the whole time." Jack's breath hitched. "I walked here. I boarded the search train." Slater shook his head. "No, Jack. You never left the Cascade Belle. Days." He left his job, splitting his time between the two unpredictable years that brought no certainty to life in the past. Jack's heart thudded painfully in his chest. It matched the day on the ticket stub he'd taken from Slater. Only now, the date had changed. It matched today, Chapter 6, he wouldn't. Jack stood, brushing snow from his coat. The shadows of the passengers flickered near the door, watching him silently. Slater stepped forward. "There's a way to bring it back," Slater said, his voice shaking. "The train, it's stuck between here and wherever it went. But the tracks aren't gone. They're just hidden." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Hidden how?" Slater gestured toward the far end of the station. "Beneath the floor. There's a switch. The conductor mentioned it once, said it could reset the line." Jack didn't waste time. He crossed the room, shoving aside old crates and broken tools. Slater helped, his pale hands trembling. After a few minutes, Jack's boot hit something solid, the metal hatch. Jack knelt down, brushing away dust and snow. A brass handle stuck out from the floor, worn but sturdy. Jack pulled it, and with a groan, the hatch swung open. Inside was a long lever, rusted but intact, the kind of switch that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Jack glanced back at Slater. "What happens when I pull this?" Slater hesitated. "The train comes back, but who's there?" Jack asked. Slater's eyes flickered toward the snow-covered tracks outside. "The ones who took us." Jack exhaled, gripping the lever. Whatever haunted these mountains, he wasn't letting it win. He pulled. At first, nothing happened. Jack straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The storm outside seemed to calm, the wind slowing to a soft hum. Then he saw them, dark figures emerged from the snow, faint shadows at first, but growing clearer by the second. Jack's hand shot to the revolver on his hip, but deep down he knew bullets wouldn't do much against whatever these things were. The figures moved closer, gliding toward the station, their faces pale and hollow. Jack recognized some of them, faces he'd seen in the dining car, the passengers who had vanished. But their eyes weren't human anymore. One of them, a tall man in a torn suit, reached out toward Jack, his fingers stretched unnaturally long. Jack stumbled back, his heel catching the edge of the hatch. "You can't stop it," the man whispered, his voice hollow and cold. "It's already begun." Jack gritted his teeth and pulled the lever again. Sparks flickered around the base of the switch, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The figure lunged. Jack fell, his back hitting the floor hard. Cold hands wrapped around his arms, pulling him toward the open door. Snow swirled around him, and for a brief second, Jack felt the warmth of the fire vanish. But then something shifted. A low rumble echoed in the distance, the sound of wheels grinding against steel. Jack's head slid toward the window, and through the swirling snow, he saw it, the Cascade Belle. The train slid into view, headlights cutting through the dark like two glowing eyes. The engine screeched, steam billowing as it pulled into the station. The figure stopped. Jack scrambled to his feet as the train doors hissed open. Warm, golden light spilled onto the platform. Slater's shadow appeared beside him. "You did it," he whispered. Jack barely had time to respond before the world shifted. The snow dissolved, the station fading into soft velvet and polished brass. Jack blinked, finding himself standing inside the Cascade Belle's dining car once more. The tables were full of passengers, their laughter and chatter filling the air. A waiter passed by, tipping his hat. "Good evening, Mr. Gahan." Jack turned, staring at his reflection in the window. The station outside was gone. The train moved smoothly along the tracks, as if nothing had happened. But as Jack glanced down, his hand brushed against something cold in his pocket, the gold ticket stub. And this time, it bore no date at all. Chapter 7, The Ghost Conductor. Jack Callahan sat stiffly in the dining car of the Cascade Belle. The golden light warm against his skin. Laughter and music floated through the room as passengers chattered over plates of steak and glasses of wine. Everything felt normal, but Jack knew better. He gripped the gold ticket stub in his pocket, its edges cold and sharp against his fingers. He didn't know how or why, but the train was stuck, trapped between this world and something darker. He was going to pull it back. The soft chime of a bell echoed through the car. Jack looked up as a figure stepped inside, the conductor. Jack stood as the conductor approached his table. "I don't believe we've met," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. The conductor's pale lips curved into a faint smile. "You could say that. But I've been here the whole time, Jack." Narrowing his eyes, Jack said, "I know what's happening. This train, these people, they're stuck." The conductor tilted his head. "They aren't stuck, Mr. Callahan. They're safe. They exist here just as they were." Jack took a step forward. "You're not a real conductor." "What are you?" The smile faded. The conductor's shadow darkened, spreading like ink across the floor. "I am this train. I keep them here. I protect them from what lies beyond the veil." Jack's hand tightened around the gold ticket. Stub, "This isn't protection, it's a prison." "They don't want to leave," the conductor replied, his voice sharp now. "And if you pull that lever again, you doom them. The storm, the cold, they won't survive it." Jack stared at the faces around the car. People smiled, ate, and laughed, unaware of the danger just outside the windows. "I can save them," Jack said firmly. The conductor's eyes narrowed. "You can save yourself. No one would know if you left them behind." Step off at the next stop, Mr. Callahan. Forget about this. Jack could feel the weight of the gold ticket stub pressing into his palm. He knew this was the choice the conductor was offering: walk away or risk everything. But Jack had never been the kind of man to leave others behind. "No deal," Jack said. The conductor's eyes darkened to pitch black. If he could pull it here, maybe he could bring the train back for good. Jack burst into the locomotive, snow swirling around him like a living thing. There, beneath the controls, he spotted it, the brass handle of the lever. "Don't, Jack!" Jack spun around. The conductor stood in the doorway, his shadow flickering like fire in the wind. "They belong here," the conductor said quietly. "So do you." Jack didn't respond. He shoved the gold ticket into the slot near the lever. It fit perfectly, clicking into place. The train groaned, and the floor trembled beneath his boots. Jack yanked the lever. A deafening sound filled the air, a mix of steel grinding and distant voices. Outside, the snow began to lift. One by one, the passengers appeared, blinking as if waking from a long sleep. Henry Slater stumbled out of the lounge car, looking around in confusion. "Jack?" Jack nodded toward him. "We going home?" The Cascade Belle slowly pulled into Denver Station at dawn. The sun broke over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jack stepped onto the platform, his boots striking the wood with a familiar weight. The passengers followed, yawning and stretching as if they'd simply slept through the whole trip. They didn't seem to remember. Slater stopped beside Jack, squinting into the light. "You remember any of that?" Jack asked quietly. Slater nodded, his expression tight every second. Jack pulled the gold ticket from his pocket. It shimmered faintly, but the date was gone. "You think it's over?" Slater asked. Jack watched as the Cascade Belle rolled away, disappearing down the tracks. "I hope so," Jack said, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. Chapter 8, Ghosts on the Line. The snow had melted by the time Jack Callahan returned to Denver. The streets were busy, and the sun felt warmer than he remembered. It was almost as if nothing had happened, like the Cascade Belle had never disappeared. Jack wasn't sure how to feel about that. He sat at his usual table in the corner of the cafe near Union Station, nursing a cup of black coffee. The gold ticket stub rested on the table in front of him, catching the light every time he shifted. The date was still missing, but his name was clear as day: Jack Callahan. He'd been home for 3 days, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time Jack closed his eyes, he was back on the train, hearing the laughter in the dining car, feeling the cold creeping in through the windows. He flipped through the pages of an old newspaper, scanning the archives for any mention of the Black Summit disaster. The story was short, tucked in the corner of a faded page from 1894, Black Summit wreck. Freight train found abandoned. No survivors. No crew. Jack frowned, tracing the headline with his finger. The article said the train had derailed, but no bodies were recovered. The tracks were intact, and no one could explain how a fully loaded train simply appeared without anyone on board. He set the paper down, staring at the gold ticket. Maybe the Cascade Belle wasn't the first. Maybe it wouldn't be the last. Later that afternoon, Jack returned to his apartment. A telegram was waiting for him, slipped under his door. It was from Henry Slater. "Jack, I saw him. The conductor. Jack was standing by the station last night, watching. I don't think it's over, Jack exhaled slowly. He folded the telegram and headed for the station. A train bound for Chicago was set to depart at noon, and Jack decided he'd take it, maybe get some distance from Denver and clear his head. As he boarded the train, the conductor greeted him with a polite nod. Jack handed over his regular ticket, but the gold stub remained tucked safely in his pocket. The train lurched forward, wheels grinding against steel as it pulled away from the platform. Jack settled into his seat by the window, watching the snow-covered landscape blur past. Then he saw it, running parallel to his train, just beyond the trees, was another set of tracks. And on those tracks, gliding silently through the snow, was the Cascade Bell. Its windows glowed faintly, and shadowy figures filled the dining car. Jack's eyes locked on the conductor standing near the engine, his hollow gaze fixed straight ahead. Jack's grip tightened around the gold ticket stub. The train beside him slowly faded, vanishing into the forest like smoke in the wind. Jack leaned back in his seat, exhaling quietly. Somewhere out there, the Cascade Bell was still running, and deep down, Jack knew the tracks would lead him back to it sooner or later.